Hello, dear viewers. This is the latest episode of the Free Marketeers podcast, coming to you from the Free Market Foundation in Johannesburg.
Not supposed to tell people where we are.
It's a secret location.
I wasn't aware that objectivists were that paranoid.
Hey, well.
We're all libertarians there.
So I thought today we'll start off by speaking about the UK election. So results have been streaming in. I think right now we're about at 649 seats out of 650 declared.
One left.
Yeah, so only one seat left, and the Conservatives have essentially won through a landslide.
Yeah.
They've beaten the Labour Party by a huge margin.
Yeah, they got 42% of the vote, wasn't it?
Yeah, for something
Yeah.
like 42% of the votes, which is unheard of for the UK, because
Yeah.
usually like 30-something percent and 30-something for the Labour.
Yeah, I think they got like, what's it now, 60% of the seats because they got 43% of the votes. I mean,
Yeah,
that's a different topic,
Sure.
the silliness of that system.
no, but
yeah,
it's
ridiculous.
okay. We disagree on that, but I think it's a good system.
Wow, it's a great system.
Because if you think about
You
it,
get a majority when you don't get a majority. Wow.
so if you think about it, Martin, the way in the UK they had the referendum, which was a PR-based sting, and then the referendum went. And then when it comes to implementing it, they went to the people in terms of the constituency-based system. So the Brexit has now been endorsed through both the constituency-based system and the PR-based system.
Yeah, but this is a general election, not a referendum.
No,
Sure.
but my point is it's been endorsed through both means, through
Yeah,
general
what was the
election and
biggest
through
issue?
a
Yeah.
Yeah, no,
referendum.
that's fine.
Yeah.
But I mean, the system in itself has been ridiculous for years now. I mean, the last election, the UKIP got something like, I don't know, 1/3 of the votes, and they got no seats whatsoever. And the party that got fewer votes than them by like hundreds of thousands got like 20 seats.
Sure.
Like it's absurd, but yeah.
But if you look at what I saw right there, I think we're already into it. So let's
Yeah.
just continue.
Yeah.
if you look, for example, at the Brexit Party now, well, if without the Brexit Party, I don't think it's very possible that you would have had a hung parliament in the UK, because if you look at dig down into the results in the areas where Labour lost, there's always a huge, in many cases more than the Conservatives, huge swing from Labour towards the Brexit Party, and that allows enough the Labour to drop enough for the Conservatives to go ahead. And so I think they played an important function, and I think that's the role that they decided to play. So I don't think you could really see that as bad, because if you look up at it forced the parties that believed in Brexit to cooperate with each other and come up with a middle position, sort of, because Nigel Farage didn't like the Conservative deal that Boris negotiated. And so they couldn't agree, but he said, okay, this is the best way to achieve Brexit. I think I see the beauty of the UK system. I'm not saying it's perfect, because every government system is always going to have it's always going to be inherently flawed. So there's always going to be issues.
Proportional representation is just better in almost every way.
Well,
Especially when you add in the electoral college.
So this is the
Well,
interesting.
it has its perks, but the PR system, I think, if you're looking at it from a democratic perspective, and you want the votes to be reflected in how Parliament is constituted at the end of the day, you want a proportional representation system.
Sure.
And I think the single transferable vote system is then the best, because you still elect candidates, so you eliminate the problem of electing parties. So you still have that accountability, but it's still proportional, and then you can choose your first, second, and third choices, and it's a nice system.
Oh, okay. No. If you believe in a single transferable vote, it's different from the PR system. But I think if that's what, because what frustrated me was listening to Nigel Farage talking about he's going to focus now on reforming the electoral system to bring about a PR system. Whereas for me, it's a no-brainer. If you have a single transferable vote system, then I think that's what he was. Because I think what would have happened anyway, a lot of people would have had the Brexit Party as their first choice, and then had the Conservatives as their second choice.
Yes.
So I think that's what he should be calling for. And some people would have had the Conservative Party as first choice, and then the Brexit Party as second, and some as Labour as first, and then Brexit Party as second, and so on. So I think that's what he should be fighting for. In PR system, I don't like. I've seen it here in South Africa.
To an extent, it is a PR system. There's another single transferable vote is usually attached onto some kind of PR system, and it's best of both worlds. I just can't remember the name of it now, but there is and you have it with the open list system, whereas South Africa has a closed list system. So it's just all around better. But the first past the post system is like We got the worst of it in South Africa. That's how we got apartheid as early as we did. The National Party didn't get a majority, but they got the majority of the seats because of this very same system. So yeah, it's to me it's ridiculous that someone like in the UK now. The Conservatives are definitely the lesser evil when you look at Comrade Corbyn.
Sure.
But getting 43% of the vote and then 60-something% of the seats. That's not what the British public asked for. That's not how they voted. So it's somewhat silly. I think I don't see the point of keeping the system.
Well, don't you think the logic of the system is that you have all of these constituencies which are essentially self-governing, and then they can decide. So it's made up of multiple small units, and they can decide of how much of the self-government that exists within that constituency they want to hand over to.
It makes more sense in a federation. I would say a first past the post system in a federation makes more sense, but the United Kingdom is very centralized. It's parliamentary sovereignty 101, and constituencies are basically just areas that get represented, so they don't have any self-governing powers or anything like that. But
if you look at I do agree with you in terms of the law as it stands in the UK, that is very centralized, just looking at the letters of the law. But a lot of the things that happen in the UK, just I used to be as skeptical as you are in terms of their unwritten constitution. But if you look at things like respecting the independence of the countries that make up the UK, like Scotland, allowing Scotland to hold a referendum, devolving power to Scotland, Wales, Ireland, and so on. So I as much as they don't write these things down, but they have conventions that effectively make them a federal state.
Yeah, but it's very precarious. It's extremely precarious because it always depends on the mood
right sort of
the
climate,
public. If you have a good climate, then it's all great. But if the moment you have a Hendrik Verwoerd that comes around and he's a populist, bombastic guy, and he grabs the public's imagination, then he can grab it and run with it anywhere he wants. And that's what we had in South Africa. The United Party of Jan Smuts, they were very steeped in the British tradition. They were racists, don't get me wrong, but they were very much steeped in that same tradition. And then all of a sudden, the National Party wins in 1948. And then if you look at the academic literature around that time, like people from Britain, Canada, New Zealand, all share the same system. South Africans were like, we have no idea what the hell is going on here, because these fascists almost have now taken over the system, and they don't respect our institutions. And like, wow, what's going on? It's like, well, the logic of your system allows this. So it's like, don't be surprised.
But for some reason, the culture just is persistently used. I don't know what you want to add something, Chris?
I don't know if it's like an education thing, if that's part of it, or just how you're brought up in Britain. But like what you mentioned with the flaw in the system, that's the same point we make about big government. If the wrong person gets in charge, they're going to abuse it.
Yes.
So I think it's sort of the same sort of thread runs through that kind of thing. What you mentioned about Comrade Corbyn, I was going to start this by talking about Rule Britannia now, because the Conservatives won, so we should be very happy, right? But I'm quite worried about blonde Boris, so I don't know if we want to get into like the specifics of it.
I think we should.
So Johnson himself, he's campaigned on big government spending. And I'm quoting him here, he talked about buy British, and that the British government with Brexit, it gave them the mandate to interfere in business, in business in Britain. So in no way is this neither this nor Brexit are guarantees of more individual freedom and liberty in Britain.
No, I think that's
so
an important.
We'll have to see like how it shakes out. As you say, it could be the lesser of two evils between him and Corbyn, and maybe this will be good in the long run. But we have to see first how it manifests. Just the sort of decentralization of power is no guarantee of more individual liberty for people in a certain country or region or canton or whatever you want to call it.
No, that's absolutely true. But the only thing I would add to that was that the United Kingdom as a union has existed for 300 years with this unwritten constitution. But for some reason they managed to make it work. South Africa, on the other hand, who has had a written constitution for 25 years now. And we seem to struggle. Think about it. 25 years later, we're already talking about changing property rights.
Yes.
I mean, Labour had majorities in the 70s when it was the most socialist it has ever been, but it never took away the property rights of people in the
but
UK.
remember that in the UK's history there were various points where they nationalised and renationalised and renationalised industries.
But they paid for it, It's like...
Sure, there's expropriation with compensation, but I mean a completely nationalised industry, and it's like there are a bunch of private companies, and that's what Corbyn wanted to do again. I can't remember specifically what industry was targeting other than private schools, which is in and of
Not
itself.
the railways or
the railways.
Yeah, I think electricity. Wanted to renationalize electricity. That's what I recall. There are like 5 or 6 big British electricity providers, and he's just like casually saying, "Oh yeah, if we win the election, we're gonna nationalize those companies." Hey, CEO, hi.
Well,
It's
he's looking
sickening.
at what's happening in South Africa, and he clearly sees that a nationalized electricity market works.
I mean, it's, to me, I wouldn't say that the unwritten constitution has actually worked. I think there's, compared to South Africa, I would say there's more uncertainty. I think we've done better in the department when it comes to certainty, simply because it's written down. I mean, that is what you get from a written constitution, is you get a level of certainty, you can plan your affairs, and I mean, we've known about EWC for a few years now. They said we're going to do this, so at some point it became relatively certain that they're going to do this. But in Britain, they can literally say the week before the election, "Oh yeah, we're going to implement expropriation without compensation," and then the moment they get elected on election day, they expropriate everything. That can happen. The chances of it happening are very slim, because I think Britain is, I mean, it's the birthplace of liberty as an idea, John Locke, etc. So I guess they have a sentimental attachment to these ideas. The same is true to a greater extent in the United States, to absolutely no extent in South Africa, unfortunately. But the point is still that it's extremely precarious, and that worries me.
But it's no guarantee that it, even a written constitution, that it'll be a safeguard. So I think, as you point out, but it's just, we just want as many possible barriers as we can implement.
You know, as I've grown older, I've sort of come to prefer a culture of respecting individual liberty over like having it written down. Like,
why not both?
If I had to choose, I would choose both. If it was my choice. But if I could only choose one, I think I would choose the culture every time, because from just what I've seen, I think cultures of liberty are more durable than written constitutions. That's just my view on it. Yeah, but I know how lawyers are. They want to see things written down.
Look,
they hate uncertainty.
Law is downstream from politics, and politics is downstream from culture. But the law is almost expected to be the thing that erects the barriers. And when you come with the idea of, hey, let's not write it down, it's like, well, let's write it down instead. I mean, it's just better in every single way. And I think if Britain takes its current constitution, not... And I know, I don't want Britain to have a written constitution right now, because it's going to have the right to not to be offended, the right to healthcare, NHS, it's all going to be in there. But like, I have old books on the British constitution where they just go to the bare bones of the... And if they take that and they write it down and they say you can't amend this without 2/3 in Parliament, I think that would be better for Britain. I think that would just be like fixing the election periods. Like this thing with Johnson now is ridiculous, because Parliament passed a law 2 or 3 years ago saying the term of Parliament will be 5 years. Like that, the days of just having snap elections are over. And now they're like, well, actually, let's pass another law that says we can have an election now.
True.
So parliamentary sovereignty is schizophrenic.
The point on that, so they could have done that. This is I think actually reinforces the point. They could have said, let's do it the 50% way, which it was allowed within their system. They could have said, let's ignore the previous law we passed, the Fixed Term Parliaments Act, and just pass some motion 50 plus 1%, and then we have an election. But they didn't. They decided to go to the Fixed Term Parliament Act route and do the hard work of convincing the Liberal Democrats and Labour to agree to an election, and it worked. I mean, this is what's fascinating for me about the UK. They could, like, theoretically they could do everything you say, but they just don't. Which is...
I agree. There is this culture of democracy, maybe not liberty, but democracy certainly. But it's precarious.
Yes.
And I think the way you eliminate some of the precariousness by writing it down, not all of it. Obviously, you're never going to have a foolproof, totally autonomous,
of course,
self-enforcing constitution. It just doesn't happen. But you need to put in as many safeguards as possible. And I don't see why the British don't write down what
sure.
their constitution is. I mean, I just don't
So
see the
I
argument
wanted
for it.
to before we move on, let's just agree to disagree for now. We can revisit
Absolutely.
it later. Yeah, but I want to like in terms of content, what Chris started talking about. It's important also to realize that the ideological spectrum of the UK. For example, I know you've done some research on the Liberal Democrats. Maybe you can tell us ideologically how it's constructed. For example, what you're talking about now with Johnson, he's a one nation Tory, so he comes from an older strand of conservatism than Margaret Thatcher.
Sure.
Margaret Thatcher comes from a newer strand, funnily enough, even though Johnson is younger. But Margaret Thatcher comes from a newer strand which values free markets and which sort of developed because of what the fights against the USSR, people seeing that how much of a failure socialism was. Whereas Johnson comes from a Benjamin Disraeli school of one nation Tories or conservatism, which means that as a person of means in society, you have a duty or an obligation to provide for people who have lesser means. And so
From
I think
each according to his ability to each according to his needs.
There we go.
Yes.
so
Yeah,
that's-
just
we have a
how you
different
dress it
word
up.
for
We
that.
dress it up in classism or racism or nationalism or
they don't value equality, but they do say that if like they just think that the gap shouldn't be too big.
Yes.
That would be bad.
The gap is not bad, but it shouldn't be too
Yeah.
big. So maybe you could talk about the Liberal Democrats.
Yeah,
a
I
little
mean,
bit.
it's interesting. The Liberal Democrats used to be the Liberal Party, and they also held the government of Britain up until like on and off up until I think 1921 or something, when it just became Labour and the Tories. So the Liberals used to be a big thing, and they used to be relatively classically liberal. Like they introduced welfare, obviously, as one tends to do apparently in human history, but they were far more liberal in the way we believe in it. And then it went downhill in the 20s, and then in I think it's the 1980s, they merged with God help them, with the Social Democratic Party, and now you have the Liberal Democrats. So they have these two wings. They have the kind of classical liberals. I think they call themselves the Orange Book liberals, because a few years ago they wrote something called the Orange Book.
Okay.
It was the classical liberal manifesto for the Liberal Democrats. But the Social Democrats are still a massive force in the Lib Dems. So yeah, that's made it difficult for me to come out and say, I really hope for a Lib Dem victory. It's like, there's a little bit of social justice nonsense there. They're not like the Lib Dems in Australia, which are great. The Lib Dems are a mixed bag.
as with any thing.
And then maybe Chris, you can just explain the ideological framework of Labour, and then we'll move
the
on
party
to
you basically agreed with. Yeah.
Exactly.
Wow,
Your
here we go. Okay, thanks for putting me on the spot here. FYI, I'm a socialist in objectivist clothing. Labour, the classic sort of big government spending, nationalisation, as we mentioned, taxation of the rich, if you want to put people in those sort of Marxist classes. And very progressive in the negative sense of the word, so big P. Progressive. So I think that was this whole election. I expected the Conservatives to win, not by such a big margin.
Yeah, no, that was a surprise. Jeez.
But again, it's a rebuke to the sort of the left and their view of people as serfs. It's sort of the view of, if they vote for things which the sort of media and the commentariat and those on the left in politics, which they don't expect, they label them as racist and backward and that sort of thing. So this is another rebuke to them. This isn't to say, of course, that the populace of Britain agrees with Corbyn and the Conservatives. They could just very much dislike with Johnson and the Conservatives. They could just very strongly dislike Corbyn. It's sort of the Hillary versus Trump kind of thing. People just really didn't like Hillary. A lot of them obviously like Trump. But it's an interesting thing to look at and try and piece apart certain strands that the Conservatives won. I don't know what about them I would consider sort of classical conservatism, maybe some sort of pride in the nation. That's about it. But the rest of it is very much like government involvement, government action, that kind of thing. And that to me is not necessarily conservatism.
Yeah, they're keen on the surveillance state and so on in Britain. So, like, we're not endorsing the Conservatives by any means. They're very much statist and anti-liberty in their own way. But I mean, Jeremy Corbyn, that would have been a disaster. Totally. So this is better than that.
Yeah. No, and I'm glad that the UK electorate really rejected Corbyn.
Yeah.
I think that's one thing that everyone can agree on.
Sure.
The best thing about the election is the rejection of Jeremy Corbyn.
Yeah.
Everything else you can argue about, and it's fair enough.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
And then on Eskom, I don't know if there's any more to say about this privatized competition. Is there more? Is there something else?
Well, I'm hoping that you all can watch this at some point this weekend because of the load shedding. I think we're on stage 2 now, but I don't know when they might bump it up. Yeah, I suppose it's we have to keep hammering the message. You can see the effects of socialism. Like sometimes when you listen to us, maybe we sound too abstract and we're talking about these ideas and what impact does all of this have on your lives. When you're driving home from work and sitting in traffic for 3 hours instead of half an hour because all the lights are out, it's because of socialism. The wrong ideas. When you can't stay at home and you have to go to the shops, for example, whereas you want to spend time with your family at home, that's because of socialism, because the lights are out. So just keep this in mind. These ideas have a very real effect on your lives. If we had deregulation and competition in electricity, if your provider in your area or your province didn't do a good job, you choose a different one. And this will not always, we don't want to make out that it's perfect, that it's always going to result in lower prices, but the chances are much higher that there'll be competition which results in lower prices.
True.
Because businesses have to be accountable to us. So if one power provider doesn't perform, you go to a different one.
I think I'll let you, Chris, have the last word on that because I want to move on to EWC.
Oh, okay.
I think it's the looming thing that's the sort of big elephant in the room for the economy, for individual rights.
Well,
I think this is the main event, ladies and gentlemen. It has finally arrived. So Martin could maybe describe. You could maybe describe some of the process where we are at now in terms of the process. You maybe touch on the contents of the of what's available, the bills and things.
Okay, so just to recap briefly, because it's actually a very confusing process. Parliament decided in February of 2018 that South Africa is now committed to a policy of expropriation without compensation. It appointed a parliamentary committee, the Constitutional Review Committee, to investigate to kind of whether we should do this, and if so, how. To an extent, how. And that committee reported back, I think, middle last year-ish, and said that, yes, we are going to expropriate without compensation, but simply we're going to amend the Constitution to make explicit what is already implicit in the Constitution.
Right.
They believe that the Constitution as it stands right now already allows for expropriation without compensation, which is nonsense. And they say this amendment just needs to make that clear. Now the frame of reference for that committee was that it should all be about the expropriation of land without compensation, not property, although that's a nice fantasy that they operated under. And then there was also a presidential review panel or something, which it was basically the same story. They said expropriate under certain circumstances. If the lands have been abandoned, it's hopelessly indebted. If it's held for only speculative purposes, and if there are land tenants, farm tenants or something on the property. And then they also said, and other things, so including, so it's an open list, you can just decide.
Including but not limited to.
That's what that committee also came up with. And then they introduced the Expropriation Bill. Now, the Expropriation Bill is not the amendment to the Constitution, the 18th Amendment Act. The Expropriation Bill, they got ahead of themselves and they basically put these grounds in there and said that these, but other grounds as well. So that's been... it's kind of shelved now. I don't know where the expropriation bill is. But right now, so another parliamentary committee was appointed by Parliament after the Constitutional Review Committee came back with its recommendation. And this committee was responsible for writing the amendment to the Constitution. And that is what was published a few weeks ago. The draft amendment to the Constitution. Now, this is a terrible amendment. It is almost the worst it could have been. Because what it effectively says is that, yes, just and equitable compensation, market-related, but there is also the possibility that there could be expropriation without compensation, and these circumstances must be determined in national legislation. So therein lies the problem, because the almost the best case scenario would have been, other than not having the Constitution amended, would have been for the amendment to say, you can only expropriate land without compensation in these specific circumstances, not including and not limited to, but only these 3 or 4 circumstances. that would have been the most responsible way the government could have gone about this. That would have been the way that they safeguard investment interests and so forth. Instead, they decided to go totally bananas with it, and now they've said that Parliament has it totally within its discretion to decide under which circumstances there may be expropriation without compensation, and they can decide that with a simple 50+1 majority in Parliament. So they can say, and the Institute of Race Relations has pointed this out, very worrying. Parliament can, after the Constitution is amended, say the state is now the custodian of all land and effectively the owner, and not pay any compensation to anyone because Parliament has determined this is a circumstance in which property can be expropriated without compensation. So that is extremely worrying. This amendment is not good. Now, it doesn't mean the government is going to do that. They may amend the Constitution and do nothing, and it's all going to be fine. But you should never bet on that when you deal with government. Always expect the worst. So,
not when you look at the ideological leaning of this government.
And governments in waiting.
Exactly.
So it's deeply concerning, and I think all South Africans now more than ever need to rally around the way the Constitution is currently written and reject this amendment. And even if the amendment is made, we need to continue saying you need to undo this as soon as humanly possible, because this will be a disaster. And I mean, we've gone through all the things that can happen as a result of amending the Bill of Rights in this tyrannical manner. It's not just going to be white rich land barons that get negatively affected, and if it is in the beginning, they're all gonna leave. They're gonna climb on their planes and leave, and they'll be out of our hair. You have to worry about ordinary poor, mostly poor people, and especially people from minority groups like gays, trans people, religious minorities. Be very concerned and stand against this.
Now, Martin, before I move on to Chris, I wanted to ask you a further question. Like, you mentioned something later that you can't amend the Constitution to only limit it to land. So could you maybe perhaps explain for the viewers why that is? Why government can't do that and say we will restrict this to land?
Well, they can do that. They can put the words in the Constitution, but it's never going to work out like that, because according to our Roman Dutch common law tradition, whatever you put on the land becomes part of the land. It's the process of accession. So if you put your house on the land, it's one thing. It's not the house and the land, it's that property. So if they expropriate land, they're going to expropriate everything that sits on top of that land. They know this. The amendment actually says this includes improvements to and buildings and structures on the land. So they're very open about the fact that they will come and they'll expropriate your business, but say they're only expropriating the land. So that's terrifying. To be honest with you, this keeps me awake.
Can either of you explain to me how in any way this encourages investment from local or foreign investors? How, let's say someone from America wants to come invest in the country and build a factory or something. If this goes through, they can, at any point the government can say, well, that factory that you built, we're not just going to take the land, you can keep the factory, like the whole thing. So why on earth would you take this risk?
No, that's the $1 million question, Chris, and I think a lot of millions of dollars are going to be lost in South Africa over the next few years. I mean, it's almost funny, but I guess then my next question to both of you would be, tactically and strategically, what's the best way for viewers to beat this? Like, because we can't tolerate this, we agree that this can't stand. It will implicitly or explicitly make us all unfree immediately if it gets passed. So how can we defeat it? What's the best way to do that?
Well, I guess the first thing is to just make your voice heard. A lot of people really don't appreciate the power that the opposition outcry has, to the extent that most opponents are totally silent. If we can create the impression, and I think it's a reality, but at least create the impression that most people are against forceful redistribution of wealth. I think that's true, but we just need to create the impression, then I think we'll defeat it. But that means that you listeners and viewers, you need to write letters, articles around the dinner table. You need to just tell people that this is wrong, and for the reasons we've described and written about, tell people why this won't work. I mean, if you're a university student, when your property law lecturer just glazes over it, maybe put up your hand and say, hey, you can't just leave that there. Stuff like that. But then also there are a select few organizations in this country who are fighting against this. The Free Market Foundation, the Institute of Race Relations, I think the Ellen Suzman Foundation to an extent, Solidarity AfriForum. All these organizations are absolutely against this amendment, and you could do a lot of good by helping to fund these projects and these organizations. The FMF currently has its 1 million rand challenge over the festive season, so any donation you make to us, I think until the 18th of January or thereabouts, will be supercharged with 50%, so it will be almost doubled. So consider stuff like that, and then we'll do the best in our capabilities to fend off this, to be quite frank, this attack on constitutionalism.
And Chris?
Yeah, just existentially, this is probably the biggest threat facing South Africa, modern democratic South Africa. The country in its new iteration, which we're all supposed to be so proud of, has never faced anything like this. EWC takes us back to apartheid South Africa, where the government could decide who could own what, who could live where. So if that sort of thing is abhorrent to you, as I think it ought to be, and as I think for many of 99.5% of you it is, make your voice heard. Like, call into radio shows when they're talking about this sort of thing. Say why you think it's wrong. The majority of people in South Africa are black Africans, and this is going to affect them the most, because any government that comes into power, it's going to have the power to take their property and their land, and they can do this for any reason. I mean, inevitably they'll run out of money because they want to spend on everything. So when they want to raise some more money, they'll take someone's land and sell it or do whatever they want with it. And by virtue of black Africans being the majority, their property is going to be targeted. Maybe in the first 5 years they'll take, I don't know, the farms in Stellenbosch or something. But their target will inevitably shift.
And the poor simply cannot leave. They have to deal with whatever the consequences of this is. But if you go after the rich farmers, there's nothing keeping them.
A lot of them are already left in any case.
Exactly.
And again, for the politicians who would support this sort of thing, they're not going to bear the brunt of the consequences. They can go overseas. They can. It's the same thing with the NHI, for example. They can get their healthcare overseas, so they don't have to live with the reality on the ground, which many people are going to have to suffer through. So simply, stand up and make your voices heard, as Martin has said.
I think I have nothing to add to that. I think you guys both covered it excellently. I will just say that just because the government hasn't done something, people tend to be comfortable giving government the power to do something because they are not doing it at that moment. And I think this is the case here. The amendment gives the government the power that it should not have, just because I'm pretty sure that Ramaphosa, I'm not sure, you never know with government, but I think Ramaphosa is probably not going to be going around seizing people's property. So I think we will be safe for the duration of this term. But then what happens with the guy who comes after Ramaphosa? Will we say the same about Ace Magashule? What if Ramaphosa is defeated at some ANC conference even next year, and then you have a President Magashule who believes in radical economic transformation and all of these things? What happens then? So never give government the power it should not have in the first place. We should have learned from apartheid that government should not have the power to seize our property. But that's my view on it. And then I think to finish, let's just Chris explain this story, so that I think people just need to hear about it. We might be running out of time, but just explain the story.
Quickly, just another example of, I guess, government hubris and the negative effects of government regulation and control. So this is specifically on education. This is a story I read on Daily Maverick today, for those of you who might want to find it. So pupils walked from Port Elizabeth to Bishu in the Eastern Cape, it's about 260 kilometers, to protest against the poor standard of education in the townships. And they were basically told by the Department of Education in the Eastern Cape that they're lying, and that there will be retribution or something like that against them, a reprimand in the new year. I mean, these are pupils from
Poor schools.
From what's it? High school and what's large school?
Secondary, primary schools.
Primary schools. There we go. Struggling with the English there. So these are young kids who are very worried about the state of their education they're receiving. They obviously think it's very important. They want to receive a good education. They've tried to take matters into their own hands and go to the people who supposedly should care for them and should be, working in their interest and trying to help them, but they've simply been dismissed in a very authoritarian, unaccountable way. I mean, Parliament shows its disregard for its supposed accountability very often, and here we see another example of government not being accountable. So it's just a sad story, and it serves to reinforce this thing, this sort of idea and concept we have that when the state is this big and has this much control, it's not accountable to the people it's supposed to represent. If there was a market for, if there was competition in the education market, as there is with sort of some of the schools like Kuro and that sort of thing, but just if it was more deregulated and government wasn't as grabby, especially as it tends to be in Gauteng with education, people would have reason to build better quality schools in townships and those sorts of areas. There's a market for it. That's where the majority of people live. So why wouldn't they build schools there? They would make a profit from it, and they would want to increase the quality, because why would you send your kids to a school that doesn't give them good quality education? Here, they don't have a choice. They have to go to a government school. So just a sad illustration. And as someone who sort of spent a lot of my life in the Eastern Cape, I don't know, the Eastern Cape in many ways is a special part of South Africa. We know with the rugby and the sports and that kind of thing, but it's never reached its full potential because it's always been hamstrung by regulations and government interference.
And I mean, this also shows how almost duplicitous government is. When it comes to free education, they're like, oh yeah, that's a brilliant idea. Even though the protesters who wanted that burned things down, I think in some cases actually killed people.
Yes.
There was actual death and destruction, but government was like, yeah, no, good idea, let's do it. But obviously the underlying reason for that is that providing free university education radically increases government's power. Because if you fund the research, you, by all reasonable accounts, get to decide what research gets done. So that destroys academic freedom. It could also have severe repercussions for the private education sector. But in this case, where the protesters don't destroy anything, they're peaceful, they ask for the bare minimum of what the Constitution demands. And that is that government should not have you falling in pit toilets, and you should actually have a chair to sit on when you're reading and learning. Government tells them to go away, because that's not going to increase government's power, because it already has the power. So you can clearly see the pattern in almost everything government does. When it stands to gain power, NHI, EWC, education, it is more. It may like put up a show like they did with Fees Must Fall, put up a great show about, oh no, we can't. See through that. They want the power, but when it comes to actual service delivery and actual stuff that government must do, like policing and stuff, it's endless moaning and groaning. They have no interest in doing it because they already have the power. It's old news to us. Stop trusting government. I mean, we always make this point, but seriously, we're not joking. These people are not your friends, and they won't. Even if it's you, the people you voted for, these are not your friends. Blue team, green team, red team, it does not matter.
No, that's that. I think that's a good place to end it, Martin. And also, Martin, could you please give us some of the social media info?
Absolutely, So please remember to subscribe to this YouTube channel. It's the big red button right under this video. We're still looking into going onto iTunes and all these other services. We apologize for taking so long, but for now, please bear with us and subscribe. Find us on Facebook and like us. That is Free Market Foundation Southern Africa, South Africa. In the URL, it's facebook.com/FMFSA. And please follow us on Twitter. That's @FMF South Africa. And our website, as always, is www.freemarketfoundation.com. This is my last episode for the year. I will see you all next year, but I'm sure these gentlemen will have a plan for next week.
Next week we can talk about real issues.
Oh, yes. I'm out of the way then. All right, but have a good one. Merry Christmas. Happy New Year. Go well. Cheers.